The following podcast is brought to you by the Johners Podcasting Network, found exclusively at WrestlingWithJohners.com. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Legends Masterclass series. I'm Johners from the Wrestling with Johners podcast, and this is episode 4. As I've just mentioned, previous guests have included Marty Jones, Adrian Street and Miss Linda, and of course Tony St. Clair. Who can forget them 3 fantastic guests that I've had on previous Legends Masterclass. And today it's no different. I've got another true legends of the British wrestling scene from the golden era of British wrestling and beyond. We will talk all about that and so much more to my guest, Mr. Smooth, Johnny Kidd. So, Johnny, it's wonderful to have you on Legends Masterclass. First of all, how are you doing?
I'm fine, John. Thanks a lot. You know, weather's not been that great. It's a little bit better today, but you just get on with it, don't you, really? And I say, today I've been out and about and kept busy, so I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent. Yes, and over here in the UK, it has been particularly cold. It's been very wintry, but I suppose you've got to expect it this time of the year, to be honest with you. But
True.
Johnny, according to my information, according to my research, you wrestled over a dozen matches in 2022. Now, you're welcome to correct me on that. I think I counted up 12 to 13 matches against the likes of Alan Lee Travis, Joey Scott, Jordan Sparks, Jordan Breaks, Harry Singh, and many others, plus a Rumble match, which you were successful in, my friend. But before we take a look at those opponents and some of those matches, coming out of lockdown, Johnny, did you ever think that you would be as busy as you were certainly in the last 12 months or so?
Well, a strange thing there, John, because I wasn't that active before the lockdown came into effect. In fact, I was in Germany at the time when it first broke. Nothing to do with wrestling. I was visiting people there. And Germany seemed to lock down before we did here in the UK. So I was traveling back from Germany back to England around about 2019, just when it broke. And I had to get a train from Germany into Switzerland and then go from Switzerland to the airport, which was actually, it's called Basel, but it's actually in France. So when I got on the train in Germany and headed towards Switzerland, I wasn't sure I was going to get through because the border was closed. But luckily I had an airline ticket and the border control people let me go through into Switzerland because I wasn't staying there. Got on the bus, went to the airport, got on the EasyJet plane, flew back to Luton, where I live here. There were 17 people on that plane only, and I was lucky to get back. The next day they had one more flight, and then they were repatriating people coming back. Yeah, so I managed to get back, and that was fine. There were 17 people on the flight coming back, and then the next day there was one more flight, and then they started the repatriation. As for the wrestling, I wasn't sure what was going to happen there, obviously with lockdown and that. I know because it's a contact sport, everyone was frightened to get near people and everyone was keeping a distance. We were told to keep at home. So for me, obviously, I wasn't doing a great deal and I just sat it out, to be honest with you. I was obviously stuck here. I couldn't do much. I couldn't travel or do anything like that. But obviously promoters were stuck because they were not sure when wrestling was ever going to start again. And obviously, that was their livelihood. A lot of them, like the hospitality suites and everything else, we all suffered, or they suffered as well.
So 2022 was very, very busy. And some of the names that I mentioned, the likes of Jordan Breaks, Jordan Sparks, Harry Singh, just tremendous young UK talents that have got a wonderful career ahead of them. Going into some of the matches, tell us about your experience of facing some of them younger, wonderful talent on the UK scene.
Okay. Well, most of the guys you mentioned there, apart from Jordan Breaks, I wrestled for a company called LDN Promotions, which is owned by Sanjay Bagga. So obviously I do some work for Sanjay, not a great deal, but if he's really stuck and he gives me a shout and I think it's convenient, I will try and do it. Obviously, I've wrestled Alan Lee Travers and Rob Joey Scott, for Sanjay and LDN. Harry Singh was probably the last opponent I had, and that was some time ago. And I've only wrestled Harry once. And again, it's good enough for me. It's my sort of thing. Joey Scott is very good, and Alan Lee Travers and myself have had a few matches. They're always interesting, to say the least. Jordan Breaks I wrestled once for a company in London. They called me down there. Can't remember the company's name now, but it was somewhere down in Wimbledon, and I did a job there. But that was a little while ago, and that particularly was not of last year. That was probably pre-COVID, I would say, John.
Okay.
So, but it's always good to come up against these younger guys, you know, although their style of wrestling is a lot different to what I learned all those years ago. But you try to adapt a certain way. And obviously I can't fly about like they do, but you can still get a match with these guys, and a match that's interesting to the paying public.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to take a deep dive into your style throughout this interview, but how exciting or different is it for you to mix your traditional British style with their more modern pro wrestling style? Obviously, you mentioned the word adapt there, and I suppose that's something that you've had to do throughout your career, facing different types of opponents.
Yeah.
But more specifically in 2021, 2022, you do have these, dare I say it, more modern, more athletic competitors going up against your traditional British style. How is that for you, to adapt? And is it also a learning experience for you going up against these different styles of wrestlers?
Well, yeah, as I say, there's only one or two of those I've wrestled a few times, and sometimes these guys, it might be a one-only match. So you've got to feel them out and see what they do. But obviously, the holds and the counter moves are my thing. I like to put those guys in those matches, and I tend to control those matches when I'm on with these guys rather than let them control me. It's a different style, but I can always get round it. As I say, once you put holds on and you can move around with these guys, and I can still move a little bit even through my age now, I can still sort of like cartwheel around and roll about if need be. And I still like the technical side of the wrestling. And again, some of these guys, they've been trained, and some of them do always come up afterwards and they'll say they enjoyed it because it's different to what they usually do when they're on with the normal type of wrestling that they do now. This is different for them completely. And a lot of them like to have a go at that sort of stuff because you never know when they're going to need it, maybe with another opponent.
Yeah. And kind of, I want to talk about your fandom a little bit later on, from when it started as a youngster, but are you still very much a fan of the sport nowadays? Do you get to see shows? Do you get to travel the country, meet old friends, and enjoy wrestling when you're not in the ring yourself?
I don't watch so much, I must be honest. Like I've heard other guys mention that they never watch the WWE or the WCW or whatever it is, or some of this stuff that goes on now. I do keep in touch with some of the boys, obviously, but as you can appreciate, we're all getting older now, and some of them, sadly, are no longer with us. But there are a group of lads from the World of Sport days that we do tend to meet up every so often. As you know, those wrestling reunions were going ahead every year. Sadly, the one in Kent is no longer running. Right. But there is one up in Leeds, and there's one in Blackpool and one in Scotland that carry on, that sort of tradition of getting the old boys all together again. And some of the London boys, we meet in London just off our own backs, really. We meet down in central London for a drink or dinner sometimes. So it's always good to see the boys, obviously, because we were together a long time. And when you think all those years ago, there was only one real main promoter. Yeah. And you saw those boys regular. Now, these days, there's so many promotions, so many wrestlers, and it's quite possible you would only see some of these guys maybe twice a year or something,
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It's
so, I mean, we actually spoke via telephone a few weeks ago to arrange this interview, and I'm pretty sure you said during that conversation that you had your last match, that you were retired. I think you mentioned Harry Singh, and that took place in October of last year. So when I first started preparing for this interview, I was fully under the impression that you had your last match. But I stand corrected, Mr. Kidd, because I did see, scouring through my socials yesterday and on YouTube, an advert popped up for Arcadian Wrestling, and there you were, Johnny Kidd, appearing in April 2023. So I don't know whether you intended to kind of continue wrestling into the new year, but you will be there in April for Arcadian Wrestling. Tell us a bit about that and what you might be able to tell us about your involvement in a few months' time.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, really, because the promoter of Arcadian Wrestling is a guy called David Wood. And I met David some time ago at a training session that I attended with a wrestler coming over from the States. And this particular wrestler was the owner of Shikara, Mike Quackenbush. So Mike came over, and I think I attended that, and David and a couple of others were there. Anyway, David formed his own promotion, and he asked me if I would appear on one of those shows some time back, which I did. And then a little while ago we were chatting, and he said it would be wonderful if he could get Mike Quackenbush over to do something for him. So obviously I'm in contact with Mike. Yeah. And I emailed him and asked him, and I gave him David's details, and between them they've sorted something out. And Mike is coming over in April for about 4 or 5 days to do one show and 2 training sessions with Arcadian up in Durham in the northeast there. So David Wood said he wants to use Mike, and he said, would you go on with him? Well, obviously a chance to go on with Mike Quackenbush for me is really something. I've wrestled Mike twice in England before. I've wrestled him in Germany, and I've wrestled him in Philadelphia when he brought myself and Johnny Saint over in 2011. And Mike's a great guy, and he's the sort of guy that I like to watch and learn from, because I say the technical ability that man has is second to none, you know, and it's my sort of thing. He puts simple moves on and holds on, and you think, how's he done that? And it's so simple, you know, but he's a good talker, Mike, and he's a good wrestler and a good worker. And I jumped at the chance, really, just to go through one more go, trading holds with that man. So that will be in April up in Durham. Yeah,
absolutely. And sticking with your British technical style, your traditional style, and I think there are certain performers in the business, both UK based and US based, that have kind of carried on this traditional British style, this catch style, this grappling style. You think of the likes of Jonathan Gresham, Zack Sabre Jr., for example, Brian Danielson. Even in the UK, you've got Dean Allmark and Chris Ridgway, some fantastic technical pure wrestlers, and many others that I've forgotten to mention. But does it kind of please you when you see these wrestlers, these grapplers that have almost kind of continued the style that you popularized in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, obviously you've mentioned a few there that obviously are into that sort of game. Zack Sabre, I was lucky enough again to wrestle him a couple of times. Yeah, it is good to see these guys like carrying that tradition on. The only thing is, we always used to say years ago, to do that style, you need somebody to do it with. So you need an opponent to do it with. Yeah. So, you know, someone like Dean Allmark and Zack Sabre would go well together. Doug Williams, James Mason, people like that would go well together. You know, you can get those guys that can do that style. And while we're talking of James Mason, to me, he's the best at that and what he does. I mean, he's so gifted, that guy. I've known him since he was 14 years old. And James Mason is really a very, very good wrestler to do British style. He can mix it and do the styles that other people do as well. So, it is nice to see those guys carrying on that sort of stuff. Yeah. Brian Danielson, I did actually wrestle him once as well when he was over here as Brian Danielson, not Daniel Bryan. But that, again, was a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely. But like I say, it's just fantastic to, and there's so much. I mean, I've seen quite a few of your matches in preparation for this, and it kind of looks like the way Zack Sabre Jr. would wrestle, or it looks like the way a Dean Allmark or a Brian Danielson would wrestle. So that kind of, they've almost embraced that traditional style and made it their own, like 20 or 30 years later, haven't they?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I believe Zack's in Japan now. I don't know what sort of work he's doing out there, whether he can incorporate that technical style out there. But I know Zack was always someone that wanted to try that. Dean, I've seen some of the stuff he does, and I've even commented it and spoke to him about it, that some of that stuff he does would probably, if I tried that, I'd probably collapse in 1,000 pieces, I should think.
Wizard. He is a wizard.
You know, and you think that they're so technically gifted, these guys. But again, years ago, we didn't have to do anything like that. What they're doing today is really good stuff. I mean, I can admire and appreciate what they do. The timing has to be spot on, obviously, and you've got to know what you're doing. But as I say, in my day, none of that was ever seen, was it?
Well, you say that. I mean, I saw one match in particular on YouTube, and it was yourself versus Johnny Saint, and I think it was probably from the early 80s, but it stands up. All these years later, it stands up 40 years later, and I was thinking, wow, you know, you would never know this was 40 years ago, and the two of you and the pace of the match and the holds and the counters and just the speed that you two were going at with this traditional style was mind-blowing, and it would not look out of place in 2023 for sure. But we'll talk more about Johnny Saint a bit later on.
Yeah, sure.
But first of all, Johnny, I want to talk about and take it all the way back to when you first fell in love with pro wrestling. As a young wrestling fan, I'm kind of expecting, but tell us a bit about pro wrestling and how you first became a fan.
Well, I think like most people, when I used to watch it on television at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, I got into that and I started watching these stars on there like the Mick McManuses and the Jackie Pallows and the Steve Logan, Burt Royal, Vic Faulkner, all these sort of guys. And I thought, yeah, I'd like to have a go at that, but you couldn't just get in and do it. It wasn't something you could just find out about. So I started to go to local shows and watch the shows. And the first show I went to was actually at Luton Town Football Club, where they built the ring into the stand on a Saturday night in 1972, I think it was. And I saw that show there. And then I tried to go to as many local shows at my local halls that I could, you know, like Dunstable, Hemel Hempstead, Bletchley, Aylesbury, Boreham Wood, you know, those sort of places. I hadn't passed my driving test then, so my father would either drop me there and pick me up. So one of the best halls I used to go to was Dunstable, the Queensway Hall at Dunstable. They used to regularly televise shows from there, and I saw a few TV shows from there. And then in 1974, I did pass my driving test, so I could take myself around and watch these shows. And obviously at one of the shows, I remember going to Aylesbury and I thought, well, how do you get into this game? And I spoke to the master of ceremonies that night, and it was a guy called Fred Downs. And I asked him, and he said, send some pictures in of yourself to the office in London and see what comes of it. Well, nothing did come of it, obviously. So I wrote away for a list of amateur wrestling clubs, and I got a list back. And the nearest amateur wrestling club was about 10 miles from me. So I joined that one. And that was over at Ampthill in Bedfordshire. Yeah. So I went there, and I was there for 4 years, from 1974 until 1978, when I got offered my first professional wrestling job by a guy called Ken Joyce. And Ken Joyce was a promoter as well as a former European welterweight wrestling champion. I found his name in a telephone directory, because at that time of the year or that time of life, you could look through the telephone directory and everyone's names and addresses and phone numbers were in it. So I took a chance. I found Ken. I knew he lived in Rushden, Northamptonshire. Guessed that was him. Rung him, told him what I did. He took my name. And I think it was a few months later, he rang me one night when I was at home living with my parents and said, if you can get down to South Wimbledon tube station on Saturday night at a certain time, I'll take you and put you on one of my shows at Salisbury. And that's what I did. I went down there. I was lucky because I had an auntie living in Balham in London, where I was born. And believe it or not, that's a connection I have with Mel Sanders and Lee Bronson. We were all born in the same hospital in Balham. So we're all born in Balham, the three of us. And I met Ken Joyce. He took me to Salisbury, and I was on my first professional match, which was October 78. I was on with a guy called Tony Scarlo, who's still around today. And every time I meet Tony, I always remark, and he always remarks as well, that was my first match. And then when I left the hall, with Ken Joyce to go back home, he said to me that Max Crabtree has given me a couple more wrestling jobs in November. One was at Hanley and one was at Digbeth. Those places run weekly. Every Saturday was Hanley, every Thursday was Digbeth. And Ken said, Max has put you on a couple of shows there. Now, I think at the time, this was early 70 or late 78, Max had just taken over the southern part of Joint Promotions. He was already in charge of the northern half, but he took over the southern half as well. Yeah. I believe Mike Marino was the matchmaker before Max came in, and then Max took over the whole thing of Joint Promotions.
Unbelievable. And just touching on kind of probably before you started your wrestling training, did you have any other sporting background? Because one thing I've noticed in all of your matches, certainly in the 80s, and I touched on it, your match with Johnny Saint, they are very fast paced. The endurance is definitely there from you in your matches. You obviously had a good engine back in those days, but and you know a lot about engines, but so you could definitely go for a long period of time. Did you have a sporting background to build up that stamina?
No, not really. I mean, I had a full-time job, remember. I was only ever a part-time wrestler. I was never a full-time wrestler.
Really? Wow.
I started with Vauxhall Motors, which was my full-time profession, in January 78. And my first professional wrestling job was October 78. So I was always employed by a company. And I used to fit in wrestling after those days working for Vauxhall. So I could fit the two in. I always had a job. I never was out of work for all that time. But no, not really. I did nothing, to be honest. I was just wrestling and then work, going home, going to bed, getting up, work, going wrestling in the evening. But as a part-timer, I did quite a few matches over the years because there was a lot of work about in those days. Even, you know, the full-timers were working 6-7 nights a week. Someone like me, maybe 3 times a week. So it's still good for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell us a bit about, give us a bit of insight into what the scene was like back in when you broke in, certainly late 70s and the early 80s, especially being a relative newcomer, finding your feet, getting some bookings here and there. But did your fellow pros welcome you? Was it a welcoming scene back then, or did it take a little while to find your feet with some of your peers? Tell us a bit about the locker room back then and how long it took before they kind of took you under their wing and accepted you a bit more, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a good question, really, because I have heard that some of the lads, when they came in, had a really tough time. I was lucky. I never went down to the gym in Brixton where I know some of the lads went on a Sunday and they were being, you know, pulled around there just to see what they knew and what they could do. I was quite lucky, I must be honest. I came in with Ken Joyce, and I think quite a few early shows I would have been on with Ken Joyce on the same bill, not necessarily always on with him, but 9 out of 10 times, you know, I find I would be on with him, you know, and then there the other times I might be on with people like Sid Cooper, Tally Hokay, Alan Dennison, people like that. So I must be honest, John, here, I had it very easy compared to what some people had. I never came across a problem coming in. They were never unsure of me, you know. And I started about the same time as another wrestler, the Rock and Roll Express, Blondie Bob Barrett. We came in round about the same time. Okay. So we traveled a lot of places together. We did a lot of jobs together. When you found that you came in as a new sort of wrestler or, you know, relatively new, you got a lot of work. And obviously they paired us up together because we didn't live that far apart. We traveled together. We did a lot of work together. So again, no, we never really had any. I can speak for Bob as well. I don't think he had any problem with anybody. We were very lucky on that score.
Yeah, good. Because you do hear the occasional story of, you know, people having to kind of work their way into the good graces of some of the experienced pros in the locker room. But I'm glad that wasn't the case for yourself and for Bob. But were you always Johnny Kidd from the very beginning? Who gave you that name, or how did you come about that name? I know your name is John, of course, but the Johnny Kidd part.
Well, when I did the first northern job for Max Crabtree and Joint Promotions at Hanley, I drove up there on that Saturday and there was a poster outside on the wall and it had the names of who was on, as they did in those days. They used to bill who was on the matches, and it had Pat Roach, Tony St. Clair, Pat O'Sullivan, Johnny Quango, and then it had Blackjack Mulligan against Johnny Kidd, a promising newcomer. And I thought, I wonder if that's me. And it was. That was me. So Max Crabtree gave me that name. I can tell you that. Max was the one. Yeah. And
wonderful. And it's a great name. It really kind of jumps off the page, and it's obviously done you good over the last 40 plus years.
Well, obviously, a few people remarked in the early days, was I any relation to the great George Kidd, who was the world lightweight champion, obviously. So that was mentioned a few times, but obviously I'm not related to him and I've never met him. I know of him, of course. But as I say, maybe he was finishing as with a surname of Kidd, and they thought, well, we'll bring another Kidd in, you know. And then apart from me, obviously, Tommy Billington was billed as the Dynamite Kid, but only with one D, whereas my surname has the two Ds. But, you know, he was quite something as well, obviously. Indeed. And he was abbreviated a lot of time. When you talked about him, they would just say Dynamite or Tommy. It wasn't very often someone would say Dynamite Kid, you know. That's how he was known as.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was so Max Crabtree gave me the name, yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. And as you are aware, you're known as one of the most proficient British technical wrestlers of all time. Clearly, you picked up this technique from training and working with Ken Joyce, as you mentioned, very early on. But what was it about that style and that technique of wrestling, the more catch-based grappling style of wrestling, that excited you and made you want to be the best possible technical wrestler that you could be?
Well, when you say, first of all, training with Ken, we never did any training at all. In my day, the only time you got in the ring was when you went there on the night of the show. We couldn't practice or go in a ring. The ring was up, but you never got in a ring before the show started, even when the paying public were outside the hall. You know, there was none of that. I think going on with Ken, obviously, learning from Ken, I learned a lot from him, obviously. So they matched us together, and Ken would feed the holds on to me, or I'd feed the holds, and we just used to go through it. And it was always like a wrestling match on the program. So I found myself on with him, Johnny Saint, as you say, Stevie Gray, Mal Sanders, those sort of guys. And then when I came up with people like Sid Cooper, obviously he was the villain, and Zoltan Bosic, another one, you know, they would sort of like take over and they would sort of be roughing you up, and you were still trying to put the technical stuff in, obviously. But my style was always that. And I think I just like that style of wrestling, to be honest with you. I was happy going on with the villains like the Rock and Roll Express. I mean, we had good matches between us. We knew each other so well. But yeah, my style was mainly that technical sort of style. And it was good. I used to watch those guys. Johnny Saint was unbelievable. You know, the stuff he did. You know, and I learned a lot from John as well, you know, but Ken was the man. I wrestled Ken so many times, and Ken was just unbelievable. And again, he wasn't a youngster when I started. You know, he was getting probably into his 40s then. And, you know, sadly, we lost Ken in 91, but he was something else when you wrestled that guy.
Yeah. Would I be right in thinking that you actually wrestled Ken's last ever match, that he chose you in particular?
I didn't wrestle his last ever match. I wrestled his last televised wrestling match. Okay. I think Ken still wrestled after that. And obviously, as you know, he was a promoter. Part of Devereaux Promotions was his promotion. And he wrestled a lot of shows, you know, not always on there, but he had his own show at the Windmill Club in Rushden and different places where he promote. Sometimes he would go on, but in those days, later on, he was mainly not wrestling, you know, he was just promoting. But yeah, I think Ken did a few more shows after that television show, but that one at Lincoln, that was his last televised wrestling match. Yeah,
and that was probably a very special and maybe a quite emotional match between the two of you as well, considering you maybe looked at him as a bit of a mentor, and he kind of gave you your start in the business.
Yeah, it was good. It was actually, funny enough, I think it was probably one of the only times I did get a bit emotional at the end, because it was about, I think it was 1982 or something like that. I think it was round about there. And
that's correct, yeah.
I think, you know, at the end of the night, because we did something like 7 rounds, and it was all Ken's stuff, and we'd, believe it or not, we'd worked there probably the show before, and it was an injury finish. I remember being injured, and then we came back to do that TV show. But yeah, it was a bit emotional, that one with Ken. But Ken was a great guy, as I say, and we often, we travelled a lot as well. We used to travel with myself and the Rock and Roll Express and Ken, because we were part of that area, and sometimes we'd all be on the same bill together. So Ken would drive us around, we'd have a chat, and it was great.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit more about the early 80s in a moment, but I introduced you at the top of the podcast as Mr. Smooth, Johnny Kidd. Tell us a bit about the Mr. Smooth nickname, the Mr. Smooth moniker, and was it something you came up with, or did somebody give it to you?
I never can. I think a lot of the guys, when you say that they're called certain names, you know, like you get sort of like, I won't mention too many, but they have I'll give you one example. Pete Roberts, the Super Destroyer. Right. He didn't call himself that. That's what the Japanese named him when he went over there. And I think a lot of people, maybe the promoters, had these names. And I do believe it was Brian Dixon that gave me the name Mr. Smooth. It didn't come from Max. I was never Mr. Smooth when I worked for Max Crabtree. I think Brian did that. So it wasn't, again, something I chose. It was something that was added. Like, you know, I hear different people, like Doug Williams. I saw him billed as the anarchist Doug Williams, you know, and I thought, I wonder if Doug's give himself that name. I don't think so. You know, I think this is how these things come about. You know, promoters sometimes put those things onto people's names. And like Dave Finlay, I mean, I've seen him billed as Superman Fit Finlay and the Belfast Bruiser. I don't know, he might have given himself the name the Belfast Bruiser, but I don't know if he'd have given himself the name Superman. I think that was something else that was added to his billing, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. And when I spoke to Adrian Street a few months back, he said that he didn't come up with the exotic part of his name. That was when he was touring in Mexico, I think in the early 80s, probably the late 70s, early 80s, and a Mexican promoter put it on the poster, Exotico Adrian Street. So sometimes these things were a blessing, but they kind of just happen out of your control. But going back to your time in the early 80s then, and am I right in thinking that predominantly during the first half of the 80s, you wrestled for Joint Promotions and Dale Martin Promotions. What was you mentioned about your schedule, but what was your schedule at its busiest? Did you ever kind of do maybe a holiday season or kind of a semi full time? Tell us a bit more about your schedule during the early time.
I think obviously the roads were a lot easier to drive along in those days. The roads were a lot clearer of traffic, so we could get to quite a few venues. And with me finishing work at 5 o'clock or 4:30 when I changed jobs to work another part of Vauxhall Motors, I could get somewhere like down your way, down to Bristol, and that by 7:15. You couldn't even do that now. No, so I used to do a lot of jobs in the south and not so much in the north. You know, the only times I went north would be probably on a Saturday to Hanley, Wolverhampton, Solihull, Digbeth when it run. And then there would be a couple of northern jobs like Manchester, but they were mainly if it was a television show or something. I would never dream of trying to get to Manchester on a Monday night for an ordinary show, or Darlington or Hartlepool. It's just impossible. So most of my work was like in the radius of where I was living. And Luton was quite easy to get out and about, if you can imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked, I think only twice I can remember working every night, 6 nights a week, twice in the whole time probably I was with Joint Promotions. That was just a busy time. Normally it would be 2 to 3 on an average week, you know, and they would be good jobs, you know, you could get there. And as I say, for me, having a job, I could still work during the day and do that. And I say it was so different in those days. You know, you could get there, you'd be on first, you get paid or showered, paid, in the car, home. I could be home sometimes before 11 o'clock if it was a close job. Yeah. So they were good. But, you know, most of that sort of work in those days, 2 to 3 jobs, I would think, a week.
Perfect. And a couple of occasions I want to mention. 1981, 1982, you got to wrestle in the Royal Albert Hall. Now, still only a few years into the business, kind of getting the opportunity to wrestle in that prestigious historic venue. And it has been known as a kind of a brilliant wrestling venue over the years, wrestling and boxing. But that must have been a couple of great experiences for you. Like I say, still only a few years into the business, getting to wrestle in such a venue as the Royal Albert Hall those 2 years.
Yeah, John, I actually wrestled there 3 times, but the first 2 appearances I was there as a substitute for someone who couldn't do the job, obviously. So it was given to me as what we called then a sub job. But to get a sub job at the Albert Hall was really something. As I say, I remember my first appearance there, I won. I was on with a guy called Steve Casey, who came from Boston in Lincolnshire. The second time I was on with a Kent guy called Johnny Apollon. I didn't win that one. And the third time I was actually billed against Steve Logan from Birmingham, the Birmingham Steve Logan. We were both actually billed there. And Steve had just started in the business then. He hadn't been in long, and he was up and coming. He was the new star rather than me. I'd been in a few years, but he was up and coming then. And he was victorious that night. But yes, it was great to wrestle there. It would have been good if it was completely full, but getting to that sort of stage, it wasn't always, you know, maybe half full, if that. So, and when it looked half full or empty, it did, the atmosphere wasn't the same then. You know, it's a big place to get some atmosphere in. And they used to take 5,000 in there. I mean, in the days of McManus and Palo, they used to pack it. And Dale Martins, I read somewhere, and I heard it from somebody as well, that when Mick and Jack were there, because they'd sold it out, they even doubled the prices of admission for people to go in. But they sold it out there. They must have packed it 2 or 3 times, those two. In the day.
Yeah, such a wonderful venue, and like I say, it'd be lovely to see more wrestling companies use that. Like I say, more modern times. But I mean, probably the biggest shop window for British wrestling in the 70s and 80s was the World of Sport TV show. And we mentioned a moment ago that you wrestled kind of various opponents in the early 80s on World of Sport TV. Ken Joyce being one of them, of course. It was very, very popular during the golden era of British wrestling in the 80s, and would have millions of viewers every single week. Easily one of the most popular kind of shows, full stop, regardless of it being a sporting event or not, on any day of the week on that particular channel. But tell us a bit about your experience of wrestling in front of the camera and wrestling on World of Sport. Was it much or any different to a regular show in terms of how you would have to present yourself or, work the camera, so to speak? But how different was it for you as a performer?
Well, I know my first television show was 1981, so I'd been in the business 3 years when Max gave me my first television show, which was at Guildford. And I was on with someone, I should think most of the viewers and listeners will know, Jimmy Breaks. So I worked with Jimmy. Obviously I was nervous the first time because when you get there, it's a lot brighter because of all those television lights everywhere. And there's usually a couple of cameras up high and a ringside camera. You weren't actually told to do anything like to put yourself towards the cameras and things like that. But some of the boys knew when they were standing in the corner, if the camera was on them, the red light on the top of the camera would come on. So you did tend maybe then to look at the camera while Kent Walton was discussing something about you in between the rounds, But we were never told to, play to the cameras or look. And the show, no, it was just you did your normal thing. Obviously, the matches were all rounds, as you know. 6 bouts would be on, 3 before the interval, 3 after. You just went on. It was just mainly like a normal show, to be honest with you. Sometimes they would say to you, there was no music in them days, but they might say, when you go out, you're in the blue corner or you're in the red corner, and you followed your second out to the corner. There was no like, you go first, you go second. In them days, they would just call for the match. Next bout, or the bout is number 3 on your program, and out we came, but after you did the second and third, or I did, you just got used to it, really. I never had any butterflies or thinking it was going to go. No, it was going to go wrong or anything like that. I was quite lucky with that as well. And I had some good opponents, as you say. I mean, my second TV match I was on with Johnny Saint, probably that one that you saw, I don't know. And then my third match was with Mick McManus, who was really my idol in wrestling. When I started, all I wanted to do was wrestle Mick, wrestle at the Albert Hall and wrestle on television. And I did all 3. And I wrestled Mick on television. So that was something. And I've still got that match on a DVD. It was copied from a VHS onto a DVD for me.
Yeah. Go on, please carry on.
No, I would say Mick was great. And then I got, wrestled Danny Collins on television, Mike Bennett, Jackie Turpin, Vic Faulkner, Yeah, all those sort of guys, and I enjoyed it, all of them. I was very lucky. I did 24 TV matches in 7 years. So, and for a part-timer, that wasn't too bad, I don't think.